Hey there, audit and fraud friends and family. Listen, we've been having some technical difficulties today, but here we are. So, listen, as always, we have a provocative topic for you all today. Today's title is When the Metric Becomes the Objective. So, let me start off by saying I read the Accenture headline twice, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, hang on tight. And it wasn't because I disagreed with it, and it's not because I thought it was reckless either. It was because I've seen what happens when a tool becomes a performance signal. And organizations do this all the time. Think about it. They introduce something valuable, a new system, a new process, a new technology, and then they start measuring how much people actually use it. And on the surface, that sounds completely reasonable, but if you've been around long enough, you know what comes next. The measurement changes behavior, and not always in the direction that you intended it. And right now, across industries, companies are trying to, they're tying career progression to AI usage. So here's what I want to explore today. Are we measuring impact, or are we simply measuring movement? So that's what we're going to talk about on today's episode. Are you ready? Well, if you are, let's go.
Welcome to Audit Bites, the podcast that helps auditors become awesome. Join us for bite-sized info and education to excel in your auditing career.
All right. All right. You've heard the topic for today's program. Let me check something really quickly. You see, we are having some extreme technical difficulties. So my camera is going to go out from time to time today. I do apologize for that, but you will still be able to hear. And better yet, while I'm here, I'm just going to switch to a different camera. It is a very bad camera, but hey, it's still going to work. Nah, never mind. We're not going to do that. All right, my friends, we're going to do today's episode with no picture of me, maybe. Well, okay. So it's a very bad picture, but we'll have to deal with it today. All right. So here's what I want to explore. Are we measuring impact, or are we just measuring movement? Are we measuring impact, or are we just measuring movement? So welcome back to Audit Bites, the podcast where we explore the hidden patterns behind risk, fraud, and organizational behavior. Because sometimes the most important audit insights aren't found in the data. They are found in the way that people respond to the data. Now, let me start off by saying this is not an anti AI episode. It's also not an anti innovation episode, but it is something I think deserves more scrutiny than it's getting. You see, recently, Fortune magazine reported something very, very interesting. Fortune magazine reported that Accenture is looking to link promotions to AI tool usage. As a matter of fact, let's show what they said. The CEO said if you want to get promoted, you've got to do the things that we do. She went on to say that failure to use AI will cost workers a promotion or their job. Failure to use AI will cost you a promotion or your job. As a matter of fact, on a recent episode of the Rapid Response podcast, she said that AI proficiency is mandatory. Now, what do you all think about that? AI proficiency is mandatory. Every employee will be forced to use AI. Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment. Sit with that for a moment. Promotions and performance reviews will reflect AI usage. Now, to be fair, and this is important, the article also notes that Accenture has invested heavily in AI training. They've invested heavily in AI training. They've built real infrastructure around this. So they're encouraging responsible adoption. As a matter of fact, this is a mass reskilling effort, and it's part of a $3 billion push to integrate AI into their workforce. So this is not some careless mandate thrown out in a leadership meeting. There's genuine strategy behind it. But here's where my thinking slows down. You see, the moment something enters a performance review, it stops being optional and it also becomes currency. It becomes a signal that says to every single person in the organization that this behavior matters for your career. And this goes beyond understanding it. This means using it regularly, using it visibly. And so now these types of signals, they shape behavior in ways that aren't always obvious. They shape behavior in ways that aren't always obvious. So let's talk about it. Think about it from an employee's perspective. You're a senior consultant at a major firm, and you just learned that how often you log into an AI tool could influence whether you get promoted this year or not. What's your rational response to something like that? Because I think what you'll end up doing is you'll log in more, you'll prompt more, please help me write this audit report. You'll make sure that usage shows up on whatever dashboard someone is watching. Here's the question though. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Because I don't think it is, but, and here's the big but. Is using AI the same thing as producing better work? Because I think that's the question nobody's paused long enough to ask. And here's where it gets even more important. When a firm as large and as influential as Accenture makes a move like this, it doesn't just affect their employees. It ripples outward to other firms, to other industries. And suddenly there's this gravitational pull towards measuring the same thing. And not always because it's the right metric, but because a major player has validated it. So my bigger question is, what happens when AI usage becomes visible currency inside an organization? What happens when AI adoption becomes more of a performance? What happens when interaction with the tool becomes a proxy for competence? So that's the tension I want to unpack today. And before we go further, I want to zoom out some because this pattern isn't new. We've seen it before, just not with AI, with something entirely different. Think about this. Let me take you back a few years. It wasn't that long ago. So let me take you back just a few years. During the pandemic, remote work went from the exception to the default almost overnight. And for leaders, that created a very specific kind of discomfort, one that didn't get talked about enough. You couldn't walk the floor anymore. You couldn't glance across the office and see who had their head down on their desk. You couldn't stop by someone's desk for a quick update about how things were going. All of those informal signals that managers rely on, body language, energy levels, and just the hum of a busy office, vanished overnight. Visibility disappeared, and when organizations lose visibility, they do something very, very predictable. You know what that is? They reach for something measurable. That just makes sense, doesn't it? So companies started using monitoring software, and not in small numbers. Does anybody remember that during the pandemic when companies started using monitoring software and not in small numbers? Am I the only one that happens to remember that time period? Because it was a very interesting time period. All right, my friends, I think we've fixed our camera issues, so I do apologize for the very, very bad visuals that we've had, but I think we fixed our camera issues. That's what happens when you actually do it live. When you're brave enough to actually come on and engage with your audit audience live, you can't hide behind editing, you can't hide behind anything else. But let me know if we fixed the camera issues, because I think we have at this particular point. Okay, so now we were talking about the pandemic when we lost the ability to see people. Here's what happened. Here's what happened. I want you to go for a trip down memory lane with me. An MIT Technology Review article reported that, well, in 2022, the adoption of employee monitoring tools surged. We're talking about programs that track keystrokes, mouse movement, idle time. Some of them even captured screenshots at random intervals throughout the day. So there was another study by MIT that found that 80% of companies were using this type of software. As a matter of fact, The Guardian described the rise of what critics called bossware, software that will turn your workday into a dashboard where certain things held true. Green light meant you were doing well, yellow light meant caution for your work performance, and red light meant you were doing something wrong at work. So we started monitoring people's usage on their computer. We started monitoring people's usage on their computer. How many of you remember this? Now, I'm going to tie this back to AI in just 1 second, but how many of you remember that this was happening? Now, from a leadership perspective, I do understand this perspective. It makes sense. You're managing a distributed team across different time zones, and you want some form of accountability. You want to know that things are moving forward. I get this. This makes sense. I'm not going to pretend that that's unreasonable, but here's what happened next. And this is the part that really matters. Employees figured out how to work the system, and they always do. And once people understood what was being measured, they started optimizing for that thing that was being measured. You want to know what I mean? Let's talk about it. The Washington Post reported that workers began purchasing these small USB devices. Some people call them mouse jigglers. And if you haven't heard of one of those, they're exactly what they sound like. A tiny gadget that moved your mouse and simulated work. So think about that. When people discovered what measurement actually mattered in the organization, they started optimizing for that particular measure. Now, I want you to picture this for a second. Someone sitting at home, maybe they just finished a focused hour solving a real problem, and so they didn't move their mouse. Maybe there was a critical Excel formula on a spreadsheet that they were trying to work through, or maybe they were updating a PowerPoint presentation. Or maybe they were just working on something that required complex, deep concentration. You ever had one of those moments where something was just so complex, you didn't really move your mouse, you were in deep thought. So during that hour, their mouse didn't move, they were just thinking. So this is where it gets interesting because if you were measuring someone's mouse movement, the system doesn't understand thinking. The system understands movement. And so now they become flagged as either yellow or red on someone's dashboard. And maybe their manager got a notification, or maybe it showed up on a weekly report. And so now the next time they sit down to think through something different or something difficult, there's a small voice in the back of their head saying, you got to keep your mouse moving. So this is not a hypothetical. Again, people were buying those mouse jigglers by the thousands. Why were they buying them? Because the system only recognized one kind of working, and that was the kind that generated visible movement. So from a dashboard perspective, productivity looked outstanding as long as the mouse was moving. So there was lots of activity, lots of green lights, but the metric wasn't actually measuring productivity. It was simply measuring movement. And once movement became the target, movement became the objective. So let me say that again slowly. Leaders measured mouse movement. Employees optimized mouse movement. So the metric of moving your mouse improved beautifully. But here's my question. Did the work actually improve? Now, some of you see where I'm going now between the parallel between this and AI. You see, I don't think anybody was actually tracking that the work improved. They were simply tracking the mouse movement, right? There's a principle in economics called Goodhart's Law. It was articulated in 1970 by economist Charles Goodhart, and the idea was deceptively simple. When measurement becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. You see, metrics work beautifully as long as they're proxies, quiet indicators sitting in the background, helping you understand what's happening. But the moment you attach consequences to them, such as promotions, raises, job security, people stop treating the measurement like a proxy. They start treating the measurement like the actual objective itself. And that's not malicious. We all do it. So I want to be clear about that. That's not malicious. People aren't trying to quote unquote cheat the system. They're trying to do what humans do. We optimize the environment we're placed in. So if a system rewards activity, activity increases, whether the underlying work improves or not. Think about it. There's a psychological layer here too. Reactance theory tells us that when people feel surveilled or controlled, they don't necessarily become more intrinsically motivated. Think about it when you tell your kids to do something. That's the exact thing that they run away from. So sometimes it means people will find workarounds. But the key insight here is that behavior changes not because the work demanded it, but because the measurement we were using demanded it. So let's tie this back to AI. If AI usage becomes how we evaluate professionals, then what exactly are we incentivizing? Are we incentivizing better thinking or just visibility with interacting with some AI tool? Are we rewarding judgment or are we just rewarding interfacing with some tool? That's the big question here. What are we incentivizing? And I'll take it a step further and say, every time leaders measure something visible instead of something valuable, they create a system that rewards appearance over impact. And if you think about this from an internal auditing perspective, we are not immune to this pattern. We are not. So let me say this again. Every time a leader measures something visible instead of something valuable, you create a system that rewards appearance over impact. Think about this from an internal auditing perspective. We should recognize this pattern immediately because we have lived it. And if we're honest with ourselves, we contributed to it. Let me tell you a story about an audit planning session many, many years ago that didn't go as planned. You see, we were doing the annual risk assessment or the periodic risk assessment, and we were deciding where to put our audit focus for the upcoming year because where you put your time matters. That's not a small decision. Most of you do audit planning, all of you should. So that's not a small thing. Our risk assessment document, it looked excellent. It was structured and it was methodical. Every risk was scored properly. It was categorized. It was weighted, ranked. There was a high, moderate, low, or red, yellow, green, however you choose to do yours. You've all seen this before. The format was consistent. The methodology was defensible. If you printed it out and handed it to a regulator, they'd smile and nod in approval. But as we were walking through it, something just felt off. And I couldn't figure it out initially. It was the kind of quiet discomfort that kind of sits in the background while everyone else in the room seemed satisfied with the conversation. But here's what I was missing in that room, in that moment. You see, the organization had made a significant strategic pivot. They were shifting major capital into a new digital revenue channel that resulted in a new technology platform, which then resulted in new operational exposures. And this was simply different from where we were 12 months earlier. This wasn't a minor thing. In other words, it was a fundamental change in where the company was placing its bets. And everyone in the room knew about the pivot. It had been discussed in board presentations and town halls. It was a documented strategy, yet when we looked at our audit plan, it barely reflected this upcoming change. We were still planning to spend a significant amount of our time on legacy operations. And it wasn't because, the risk there had grown or had diminished. It was just because those areas had always scored high on the risk assessment. The scoring formula hasn't changed. The categories hadn't been updated. And because the methodology was so consistent, nobody questioned it. You see, on the surface, the process was working. The documentation was thorough. And if you were measuring risk assessment completeness, we were performing beautifully because it was complete. The reds were in place, the yellows were in place, and the greens were in place. But were we aligned with where the organization was actually headed? I would say no. Were we focused on risks that mattered right now or risks that mattered last year? Because you see, that's a totally different question, and it's an uncomfortable one because it reveals something important about how we actually work. We weren't measuring strategic alignment. We were simply measuring process completion. Risk assessment complete, check. Audit plan complete, check. And from the outside, those two things can look identical. They have the same documentation, the same structure, and the same sign-offs. But in substance, they are completely different. They are completely different. So that experience stayed with me, but it illustrates exactly what visible metrics do. They reward the thing that you can see, that completed document, the final audit report, the documented risk assessment. But this doesn't necessarily account for the thing that actually matters, which is whether your work is pointed at the right risk, at the right time, and for the right reason. So now let's circle back and apply that to AI. If we start measuring prompt counts or how many times you actually interacted with a tool, the frequency, the percentage, the number of AI enabled workflows you have, what are we actually rewarding? I'd argue that we're rewarding visible usage, but not necessarily better risk prioritization. We're measuring visible usage, but not sharper executive communication, not faster resolution cycles, and definitely not improved decision support. And here's the deeper issue. When something like this becomes part of promotion criteria, in other words, you use the AI tool regularly, we'll give you a promotion. It doesn't just change the workflow, it changes employee identity. Let me explain what I mean by that. People start signaling. And here's the dangerous part. Here's the really, really dangerous part. AI users become associated with innovation, whereas non-users risk looking outdated. And once those social labels enter the system, the behavior accelerates. And it doesn't necessarily accelerate toward better thinking, but it does accelerate towards more visible adoption. And now, Nada says, it's crazy how professionals default to the way things have always been when the signs are under their nose. Yeah. And we auditors are kind of bad about this because we are logical thinkers, so we like our structured processes. It worries us when things change. And Nada said in her world, that's called velocity. There you go. It is called velocity. And I'm with you. Frequency is a terrible measure of success. Yeah. Frequency does not necessarily equate to impact. Now, if you are just joining us, this is episode number 79 of the Audit Bites podcast. We are, as far as we know, the only audit podcast that's brave enough to do this thing live. Because again, anybody can, edit some videos and have some really good talking points, but only a few people can actually have open discussions where there's feedback, where there's back and forth, where there is brainstorming, because we are all better together. That's why we continue to do this podcast live. What we're talking about is a recent Accenture article where they have tied AI usage to promotions in the organization. Now, I want to say, I said earlier, this is not an anti-AI episode, not at all. And I'm also not saying that what Accenture is doing is wrong. What I'm saying is, as auditors, we have to be careful what we measure and how we measure it. Because if we simply measure tool usage, that may not equate to impact. Just because you use a tool doesn't mean you're impactful. Just because you use a tool doesn't mean that you're good at it. Dan, hey, look, Dan, we gotta catch up. Dan says nobody outdates me or him, or maybe everyone does since he is married. What's that mean, Dan? Did you or are you trying to say that just because you're married, you don't have a pulse on what's happening in the world today? I'd argue you're one of the more hip people I know. If you guys don't know who Dan is, and if you like the game of chess, you got to check out his series. He plays chess live on stream. And he's actually pretty good at it, which is why you'll never see me on his podcast. And Dan, you just started a new podcast too. I can't remember the name of it now, but if you want to drop it in the comments, drop the name of your new podcast in the comments. I always feel like as auditors, my people, my audience, you should experiment and experience other people's perspectives in podcasts too. So like Nada, drop what you do into the comments. Nada is I don't want to undervalue what you do. I was about to say career coach, but it's a whole lot more than that. But when we start following and engaging with and getting to know other people, it makes us better as auditing professionals. I'll die on that hill and no one can prove me wrong. So let's get back to the episode at hand. Here's the major point that I want to bring about. The moment AI usage becomes a promotion signal, it stops being a tool and starts being a performance badge. People are going to perform to what you reward. Ta-da! People are going to perform to what you reward. So let's make this real for just 1 minute. Think about this. If you are early in your career or maybe a mid-career auditor and you read a headline like the one at Accenture, promotions will be tied to AI usage, your first reaction is probably going to be very pragmatic. You're thinking to yourself, okay, fine, I'll use AI more. And that instinct makes a whole lot of sense. You want to adapt. You want to stay relevant. You don't want to be the person in the room who looks like they're resisting change, especially while everyone else is leaning into the future. And that instinct, my friends, is very, very healthy. But here's the part you want to think through more carefully, because this is where your real career risk resides. It's not in whether you use AI or not, but it's how you let it define your value. So think about this. There's a difference between learning a tool and letting the tool become your identity. If your differentiation becomes, I use AI, that's very fragile because at some point everyone will use AI. Within a year or two, access will be so universal. The interface will continue to get simpler. The barrier to entry will be almost non existent. And so using AI will not distinguish you any more than using email or using Excel or Word or PowerPoint. However, what will distinguish you is what you do with AI. So I want to slow down for a minute. I want to slow down because this is where real clarity lives. This is where the real clarity lives. Think about this. Now, I'm going to make some people mad for one moment. But before I do that, let's go back to Dan. Dan said, no, I mean, I only date my wife. Okay, well, I hope so. Dan, going back to the comment from earlier, Dan said he only dates his wife. And I'm sure she's happy about that, Dan. Okay, I'm sorry. And I'm sure she's very happy about that, Dan. Okay, so now I'm going to say something that's probably controversial and going to make a few people mad, especially those audit departments that have rushed to adopt AI. Let me tell you guys, it's real interesting. I was talking to an audit director recently about Audit Leverage, the AI tool that I built in order to help auditors work a little bit smarter. And he said, well, my hope is to use this tool to replace many of my audit staff. And I was thinking, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, at some point there will be some attrition, right? But if you think out the gate it's going to replace your staff, you're doing it all wrong. You're falling into this trap of measuring the wrong thing. And so here's the way I see it, and I'm open to anyone who has a rebuttal. But I think AI can draft an audit issue, but it can't decide which issue actually matters in the context of the organization's strategy this quarter. So you see, the point here is AI will help you work faster. It will help you work smarter. The human that can work faster and smarter with AI is the one that is the most valuable. But now that I'm addressing the ugly elephant in the room, let's go a little further. AI can summarize risk across 100 data points in seconds, but it can't sit in a room with the CFO and determine which risks the board should hear about this month versus which ones can wait until next month. Okay. Okay, let me poke the bear just a little bit further. Let me poke the bear a little bit further. AI can generate a root cause analysis that sounds articulate and well structured. However, it cannot walk into a tense meeting, sit across from a defensive executive that disagrees with you on a critical issue, and defend the conclusion with credibility and composure. Anyone disagree with that? Because if you find me some AI programs that can do that, then we're 100% replaceable. Until that time, we need to use the power of AI to work smarter and to work faster. You see, the three things that I just named, that's still you: your judgment, your presence, your ability to read a room and know when to push and when to hold back, how to translate complexity into something that a non-technical leader can act on. That's still you. AI doesn't do that, at least not yet. And honestly, I don't think it will for a while, keeping my fingers crossed, right? So here's the warning, and I'm going to be very, very direct about this. As an audit professional, or anyone for that matter, if you rely on AI to replace your thinking instead of elevating it, you are training yourself to become operationally efficient, yet strategically invisible. Because granted, you'll produce more output, it'll be clean, it will definitely be fast, but no one will remember who produced it because the thinking behind it won't be distinctive. And here's where it gets even worse: invisible professionals don't get promoted long term, at least not in ways that last. So let me connect this to something practical. If AI helps you reduce your reporting time by 30%, that's genuinely a good thing, and that matters. But the test isn't whether you saved time. The test is what you did with the time that you actually saved. This is actually one of the reasons I built Audit Leverage. The goal was never to produce more drafts faster. The goal was to compress the noise, the mechanics, the repetition, the repetitive parts of audit work, so that auditors could spend more time on the things that mattered most: human judgment, deeper thinking, clearer communication, stronger alignment to what the organization needs from us. That's the leverage of AI, not a prompt, not a prompt count, not a usage dashboard. Thinking faster, better, with more accurate information. If you want to protect your career, don't aim to be the heaviest AI user. Aim to be the clearest thinker who happens to use AI very, very well. That, my friends, is durable. That's durable. Now, let's widen the lens for a minute, because everything I just said about individual professionals, it is very true. But it's only half the picture. The deeper issue isn't individual, it's actually structural. So let's talk about that. It's structural. What do I mean by that? Leadership decisions about what to measure shape the environment in which everyone else operates. So if you're a chief auditor, an audit director, an audit manager, anyone who has influence over how performance is evaluated, you got to understand something. When you decide what to measure, You're not just observing behavior, you're actually engineering it. So if you tell your auditors, I just want you to use AI, okay, they're going to start using it. But if you tell them, I want you to use AI first to try and reduce the amount of hours we're spending planning, now that is where you have value. That is where you add impact. Listen, it's well established management science. When you tie compensation or advancement to some measurable action, you're going to get more of that action. So simply saying we want to implement AI without a roadmap, without a purpose, without a plan, you're going to implement it and it's going to fall flat. So the question is whether the action you incentivize is the same as the outcome you actually want. Okay, let's think about this another way. Imagine two audit teams. Team A is told, we want to see an increase in AI usage across our audit department, and we're tracking the adoption rates. Now, Team B is told, we want to see measurable improvements in audit cycle time, in executive clarity, and in risk prioritization quality. Here's what's going to happen. Both teams will probably use AI, but they will use it vastly differently. You see, Team A is going to focus on demonstrating tool interaction because that's what's being watched. They'll reference AI in status updates. They'll include prompt outputs in their work papers so that next year's team can use it. They'll even make a dashboard light up like a Christmas tree. But Team B will focus on whether the work actually got better because that's what they're being asked to prove. So yeah, they might use AI, but they might not use it for every task. But their focus will be on outcomes, not optics. Their focus will be on outcomes, not optics. And my friend Juana is here. Hey, what's happening? I hope that you are doing well. You know what? I saw recently your pivot into providing services specifically for higher education. I think that's great. So Juana does accessibility. Is your site accessible and meeting ADA standards and guidelines? Not just your website, but your whole corporate communications. So if you work in higher education or any industry, but especially higher education, and you're wondering if you're in compliance, you need to hit my friend up. That's what you need to do. She's the best around at it. You've got to hit her up. Now, I said earlier, as auditors, we need to get to know people in different professions because they can actually help us do our job better. I mean that. Think about it. If I ever had an accessibility audit, I'm going to call Warner before I call anybody else and say, hey, what do I need to do? Because she's an expert in what she does. Now, with that side note, let's get back to what we were talking about. We were just talking about two audit teams that were given two similar but different directives. One was told implement AI, start using it. Another was told implement AI for this specific reason. Which one do you think is going to be more effective? I'll give you the answer. The one with a very tight directive. They're going to be more effective in implementing AI. And so now that ties back to what we started talking about earlier was the Accenture headline, where it was noted that the huge consultancy firm is mandating AI usage for all employees. As a matter of fact, they are tying it to promotions. And as I said earlier, this is not an anti-AI episode because I do think we all need to use AI more effectively. But what are we tying our performance measurements to in organizations? As auditors, are we simply tying it to we implemented it? Let's tie this back into something we started doing years ago. Many years ago, most of us started buying audit management platforms. And many of them just became work paper repositories. We were doing all of our work outside of our audit management system and then just uploading the work papers. That made absolutely no sense. But we could tell our board, we implemented this audit management system, but it doesn't meet your needs. Now, let me say this. This should sound familiar, right? Now, if you are looking for an audit management platform, you need to go to iastream.net. Myself and Thomas Molinix built the best audit management platform around. Everyone deserves to see a demo of this thing because it was built by auditors for auditors. Okay, now, when AI usage becomes a signal of competence, just the usage, something shifts socially within an organization. Think about it like this: those who visibly adopt AI become associated with innovation. Those who hesitate, even if it's thoughtful hesitation, even if there are legitimate reasons for that hesitation, risk being labeled as resistant. And once those labels enter the system, the behaviors accelerate. People will start demonstrating AI in meetings, referencing it casually, but not necessarily because it improved anything, but because it protects their status. So if leadership doesn't anchor that cultural shift to impact, the organization drifts into surface level AI adoption. You see, it looks progressive, it feels modern, but it doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes. So here's where I want to speak carefully to audit leaders. Encouraging AI adoption is not wrong. As a matter of fact, ignoring AI would be irresponsible. But measuring usage without measuring impact is incomplete. If you if you genuinely want to transform your internal auditing activities, you have to define what improved thinking using AI actually looks like. Did your executive summaries get clearer this quarter? Did risk articulation sharpen? Did cycle times decrease without sacrificing depth or quality? Those are the things that matter. Did your stakeholders' confidence in your audit department improve? Those questions are harder to answer than the simple, how many people logged in this month? How many tokens did we use this month? But those answers are closer to value than anything else. And leaders, audit leaders, you set the tone for what your department chases. You see, if you celebrate dashboards, then simply using AI will flourish. But if you celebrate improved judgment, thinking will in turn deepen. And that is the choice that you're fighting with right now when it comes to AI. That is your fight. So now let's slow this down for a moment and bring it full circle. During the pandemic, when companies monitored mouse movement, they weren't trying to create dysfunction. They were trying to solve uncertainty. They had invisible teams and they had no way to gauge whether things were moving forward. So they reached for the most visible metric they could find. Now, when firms push AI adoption today, they're not trying to create performance theater. They're trying to stay competitive. They see what's coming. They see the speed of change. They see the expectation from clients and from boards, and they want to prepare their people for it. So the intent behind both of these decisions makes sense, but the intent does not cancel incentives. And measurement always carries consequences. Again, if we measure for what's visible, simply AI usage, the amount of times you logged in, the number of tokens you use, you're going to get more of what's visible. If we measure for what's meaningful, we'll get more of what's meaningful. And I know that sounds simple, but it's one of the hardest things for organizations to actually do because visibility is easy to track. But being meaningful requires judgment. So AI is not a huge threat to internal audit. It's an actual helper. It's an amplifier. So if your audit department values strategic thinking, alignment, and clarity, AI will accelerate that. You'll move faster. You'll see patterns sooner. You'll communicate with more precision. Now, if your audit department values activity dashboards, we've implemented XYZ from ABC Company. X number of people have logged in and used our AI tool. Then you'll produce more checklists. You'll generate more documentation that probably means absolutely nothing. You see, technology amplifies structure. It doesn't necessarily replace it. It amplifies it. So the real question isn't, are we using AI? The real question is our thinking improving within our audit departments? And that's the question worth sitting with. Not for 5 minutes. Not for 10 minutes. That's the question worth sitting with to improve our strategy. Consistently sitting with it in planning meetings, in performance conversations, when you're drafting your audit reports. Because the answer to that question will determine what this profession looks like in 5 years. You see, if we get measurement right, if we anchor AI adoption to judgment, to clarity, and strategic alignment, we build audit departments that are genuinely more powerful, that are actually more trusted, that overall become more valuable to the organizations that we serve. But if we get this wrong, if we default to easy metrics, to visible ones, to saying we implemented this AI tool, we risk building a generation of professionals who perform adaptation without developing the judgment that makes the AI adaptation meaningful. You see, internal audit has always been at its best when it recognizes structural patterns before others do, when it sees the shift happening beneath the surface before the consequences become obvious. That's what we do. That's our value. And this conversation, the one about measurement, the one about incentives, the one about what we actually reward, this is the risk we should be watching right now. This is one of those moments. And I'll say it again. AI usage is not the same as AI impact. And if we remember that, we'll navigate this transition the way our profession is supposed to navigate transitions. Intelligently. Now, I want to thank you all for joining me on this episode of Audit Bites. A little bit of a different format. Episode number 79, when the metric becomes the objective. The way we measure AI in our audit departments will say a lot about our future as a profession. If we adopt it for the sake of adopting it, we're going to waste time, effort, and energy. If we adopt it strategically to solve problems, we become more valuable to our stakeholders. So again, thank you for joining me on this episode of Audit Bites. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching this episode of Audit Bites. If you receive value from this podcast, do us a favor. First, tell other auditors. Second, give us a 5-star review. And finally, talk to Robert about training your auditors. Our contact information is on our website, www.thatauditguy.com. It's also where you will find our course catalog, on-demand courses, a kick-butt blog, other podcasts, Robert's best-selling books, and last but not least, audit merch. That's right, we have audit hats, shirts, mugs and more. Thanks for watching and listening. See you next episode.